Okay, so the theme of today, you know, in order to introduce the theme of today, maybe I'll tell you a story. I was going to keep the story at the end, but actually the story probably works just as well at the beginning. I think it's a story I may have told before, but nevertheless, it's an important one, right? When my second oldest daughter, Anael, first came home from Ghana, and she wanted to give her first devar to forever. This is like the ultimate moment of parenting. Tell you guys this story? Okay. She asked for a glass of water and some oil and a fork. Okay, she's in Ghana, but she just said the words Devar Torah, so like I'm willing to do whatever you want. You want to shack the cat? Go for it, right? So I give her a glass of water and the thing of vegetable oil and a fork, and she pours a little bit of oil into the water, and she starts to stir. And she goes, you can hear her gun in it, just like oil doesn't mix with water, so too Am Yisrael will never mix with the Umas HaOlam. Mazel tov, right? Okay. Very interesting. That's what this class is going to be about. Not about that. That we know. We spoke about already from late antiquity, the fact that Jews were the indigestible element in the Roman Empire. We've spoken about the Crusades and how the smile went out of Ashkenazi Jewry. We're about to speak momentarily about how the Jews were spit out of Spain, where it seemed that they were being absorbed. And then in the end, we'll see that it's not true. But what I'm really interested in, and what's this class really about, is the fact that, you know what happens if you stir oil into water? It's true it doesn't mix, but what actually happens?
It makes salad dressing.
Yes, it emulsifies. It emulsifies. You get little globules, right? Because though the oil will not mix with the water, in the effort to maintain its cohesion, there are two forces. There's an internal cohesion, and there's an outward hydrophobia, right? It's pushing away the water, and it's trying to stick to itself. And when you apply that braking force of the fork, it begins to break into ever smaller pieces, which will not bond with each other. And that actually is an excellent example of what happens in the birth of modernity to Am Yisrael. Because the twin forces of exile and the increasing pressure is breaking Am Yisrael into pieces, and nevertheless, there are tremendous powers brought to bear on maintaining internal cohesion. We've already spoken about the development of the oral law and when the Rosh went to Spain in the last 2 years ago, actually. I think we spoke about it. Whether it was 2 years, I don't remember last week. But the Rosh going to Spain and the birth of the Tur, and a very particular perspective on, that was last week, perspective on halacha being more or less purely that which is useful now. Because of the need for internal cohesion, because the identity is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain under the pressure of the birth of modern European culture. Right? At the same time, there's that increasing notion of pushing away the goyim, right? And that was that cult of martyrdom that we spoke about in Europe that was born in the Crusades, etc. But it's important, don't miss it, because the oil doesn't bond to itself either. We're going to start having Spanish Jews that don't want to marry Ashkenazi Jews that don't really think the Spanish Jews are Jewish. We're going to have the Spanish Jews that will get spread throughout the Ottoman Empire and will come into these places where they see the other people as primitive, sort of barbarian types, and they are the bearers of high culture. We're going to see it all to the point where when you walk the streets today in Jerusalem, what you're seeing is an emulsion, not a mixture, right? Walk through Yerushalayim. There are little camps of people all over the place. And there is a tremendous cohesion within those little camps, but their ability to actually interact with others is severely limited.
Right, like Nachro people don't necessarily fight.
Right, sure would. I mean,
to marry each other.
Just to try to fight that. So one of the things we're not going to talk about, because I do want to actually get into the role of history here, but one of the things we're not going to talk about is how you solve that problem, because the way you solve that problem is actually called Mashiach. There are two ways that an emulsion gets reduced back into a, well, you have to separate the the water and oil, but how does the oil come back together? It's 2 ways. One is, well, that's settling, time. You just need time.
Right. And
the oil will eventually, we take away the disturbance, and then you need time. Right? So that's the thought of Mashiach, which is called Shivat Zion. You have to come back to a place where you can actually just settle and remove the disturbance, as Dave pointed out, which, right? The other way, however, the more radical way, is called a surfactant. You know what a surfactant does?
Yeah, they put them on oils.
That's right, because a surfactant will break up the hydrophobia, where it's pushing away everything outside it, and allow that force of internal cohesion to take over, right? And it will bring it back together. No, not a surfactant. Surfactant will do the opposite, actually. I think of the name. Lo mishane. There's a chemical process which is evading me right now, but it's important to notice the difference. One takes place and time. The other one is the ability to allow internal cohesion to overcome the external rejection. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. Now we're going to actually push the button on the blender, because if up until now it was a fork, we're about to step into the birth of modern Europe slowly. We're putting our first toes in the water of modern Europe. And modern Europe will be the blender. It's no longer a fork trying to make the oil and water mix.
Europe's a blender, then what are we living in now?
That's a discussion we can have after class. All right. So we left off. We were actually off in Ashkenaz. I want to go back to Spain. It's going to be a little bit complicated to try to do my best to keep things in good order today, because we're going to jump back and forth between Spain and Ashkenaz. Last time we were in Spain, things were getting grim. You remember the Reconquista, the reconquest of Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, by the northern Christian kingdoms has proceeded rapidly. And at first, the Jews fled to many of the northern Christian kingdoms because life was better there. That progressively, as the crusading spirit sweeps Europe and infuses the crusade against the Muslims with a particularly radical bent, it becomes less and less tenable. We spoke about that pattern of disputation. Don't forget, it's a hermeneutic battle out there. Who's got shot? Right? Has the Messiah come yet? Is the Messiah going to be divine or human being? Are the Jews or the Christians holders of the true faith? Those were the three questions that the Ramban was forced to answer in his debate with Pablo Cristiani in 1263. Right? Those questions are out there. They're still out there today, by the way. They're just less pressing because of the social structure within which we live. But they're still out there today. Now, 1391 is going to be a turning point for Spanish Jewry. We've already had some bad news, right? But in 1391, Ferdinand Martinez, the confessor to the Queen Mother, incites massacres of Jews across Spain. Now, we're not so interested in the numbers because, as I pointed out to you before, historically, there's less integrity to the numbers when it comes to death and slaughter than one might like, because usually the numbers are inflated for a very good reason, which is that the further in history something goes, the less impressive it is. So therefore, the larger you make it in its origins, the more likely it is people are going to take it seriously 100 years later. This is a problem. Nevertheless, what matters for us is this is also the first wave of mass conversion. Very important. In 1391, 100 years before the expulsion from Spain, there's the first wave of mass conversions, which creates the concept of the conversos, or as they were known in, is that tilt bothering you? As they were known in Spanish culture, Marranos. Marranos is not a nice name, basically means pigs. Conversos is like a little bit more of a PC name, but it's important to understand that at this time was born into Spain two very important things. First of all, was born into Spain the origins of racial anti-Semitism. Up until this time in history, the hatred of the Jews had been religious. Right? The Christians hated the Jews because we killed their God and we refused to accept their Savior and all that. So, well, let's back up. I mean, hatred doesn't really need reasons. People hate each other. Fine. But classical Jew hatred had been based in religion. Right? Therefore, there was an easy solution for the Jew hatred. What was it?
Stop being Jewish.
Right, conversion. And up until now, more or less, every Jew that had converted had been accepted into Christian society as a Christian, Shalom al Yisrael, sort of. Right? With the wave of forced conversions in Spain, and not just the wave of forced conversions, what happened? Suddenly all these Jews who have been progressively excluded from the economic, social, and political spheres found, well, hey, I mean, if they're going to make me be a Catholic, then I might as well actually make some money off of it. And they moved very quickly into these economic, political, and social spheres from which they had been progressively excluded. And, hey, they were Jews after all, despite what their new names were, rose to the top. Rose to the top, and there was a tremendous resentment on the behalf of the classic Spanish Catholic aristocracy, both the economic and social aspects of it, against these new Jews. So racial anti-Semitism was born in this time. What? New Christian. Thank you. They weren't new Jews. And born at the time were the laws of blood purity, the limpiada, laws of blood purity in Spain. That despite the theological problematic of claiming people who had converted to Catholicism were not really Christians, nevertheless, the Spanish aristocracy began to keep blood lineages of whose lineage was clear of Jewish blood. And this is the first appearance that we're aware of racial anti-Semitism. It wasn't called anti-Semitism yet. Anti-Semitism is a term that actually born in the 19th century, which we won't speak about. Nevertheless, racial Jew hatred.
What did they call it back then?
It was there. Jew hatred, yeah. I mean, these laws were laws of the limpiada, like the cleanliness of your blood. And that's one piece. It's a very important shift because now it means that even if a Jew converts to the dominant culture, he's still a Jew, right? Number one. By the way, the Pope was outraged by this, and he's like, "You can't do that theologically. These people are the Catholics, like you can't do that." But I mean, I can't go into European history at this point. But this was the time of the anti-pope. Right, so there was a whole schism within the Catholic Church that was going on. It's not a class in European history. You can look it up. Type in anti-pope to Google. You'll get some very interesting stuff. Everybody's excommunicating each other left, right, and center. But you know they all still hate the Jews, even if they're Christian. So that's one thing that's born is the origins of racial anti-Semitism. Right. The other thing that's born at this point is the backbone of what today we think of as totalitarian society. Right? What do I mean by that? A society that attempts through fear and omnipresence to dominate the lives of its citizens.
It didn't happen in the Roman Empire.
Not in the same way, not in the classic, the tools, like a culture of informers, cultivating a notion of fear based on informers that you're always being watched, trial in absentia, meaning you get tried, your name gets tried somewhere else. You suddenly the soldiers show up and take. People have been pulled out of their houses and killed by kings for all of history. The difference is here is this is a society of law, which is using law as a tool of oppression. I mean, if they wanted to show up and kill the Jews, that's not new. But to hold a trial for someone who is not present, based on witnesses and evidence they will never hear, to condemn them, and then to come carry out the sentence is actually, from a social perspective, to the person getting killed, it really doesn't make such a difference. He's going to mind nafkamina, like, right? But from a difference of society makes a significant difference. So the Inquisition is not yet in Spain. So to carry it forward, because I think maybe consistently, in order to make this easier, we're gonna jump a few steps forward in Spain. So that was 1391. There are a few things in here that I'm going to come back to. One very significant one is the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. Why does that matter? Because this is the end of Eastern Christendom as an independent kingdom. The Turks famously, it's the first time a siege was made with cannon, and there was a big historical debate of how much difference cannons actually made in the conquest of the walls of Constantinople, but the sounds of the cannons that break the walls of Constantinople are the footsteps of modernity approaching Europe. The Turks conquer Constantinople, they unify the East under Muslim rule, where it will stay basically until the British and the French break it up. There's some sort of reworkings in there, but for our purposes, it will basically stay under Muslim rule until World War I, when the British should carve it up together with the French, which, by the way, we're paying the debt for right now, in case you guys didn't read the news, and that sweep through Iraq that this ISIS organization is claiming that it's the final end of the Sykes-Picot Agreement from 1916. I saw that quote, and I thought, oh my gosh, this guy's no history, right? Oh, it was absolutely implemented, just indirectly. Said when we learn modern Israeli history next year, we'll talk about that. Either way, it's not just the blow to Christendom in Europe and the fall of the Eastern Empire and the rising menace of Islam, because the Turks, of course, they will make it all the way to the gates of Vienna on this push. And again, it's not a course in European history, so I can't go through it. But from not in one war, but from 1453 to I think it's 16. I don't remember the year when the Turks get stopped at Vienna, but there will be a pressure on Europe for the next 200 years right, from the Turkish surge, right? But most importantly, the cannons, the sound of those cannons, I want you to hear them. That's the footsteps of modernity approaching Europe, right? Both in the sense of modern warfare, which will play an increasingly important role in society, and in the sense of the importance that identity will play in forming nation states, right?
To give some credit to China for the gunpowder.
Yeah, you know, the Chinese, God bless them, when they figured out what gunpowder did, you know what they did with it? They made fireworks. They're like, wow, that's cool. We can do that. You know, the Europeans got there and they said, whoa, we can kill people with that stuff. You know, whatever, you can make your own judgment on that. Okay, so another piece in this, and this is kind of more directly to our story. I just add that because of the sense of modernity on the horizon. And we're going to come back to two more things, but 1480 is when the Inquisition is actually officially introduced into Spain.
What's the next 100 years in Spain like?
So 1591 to 1480 is a time of great social turmoil. Because on one hand, the massacres in 1391 were the last major eruption of Jewish hatred. But on the other hand, you literally have thousands of forcible converts who now begin to work their way into society. The society responds by a tremendous suspicion of these new Christians, right? At the same time, many of these new Christians rise to these social and economic aristocracies, so they've got a lot of power. The king, of course, is personally only interested in money, right? And as long as that money begins, plus there are also still lots of Jews there. So you got Jews, Christians, new Christians, you got lots of money. Spain, I mean, this is the age, like we can't talk about anything, but this is the beginning of the age of exploration, right? The New World is about to be opened, right? The Portuguese are already trying to get around the Cape of Good Hope and figure out a way to get to Asia and skip the Silk Route. Like Europe is bubbling and bubbling and bubbling. 1480.
So was Columbus Jewish?
No. A group of new Christians is caught celebrating Pesach. Right now, the word caught is important because this is a society that was now riddled with informers. Right? You can look at the documentation of it. It's incredible. Do your neighbors wash their hands before they eat? Do you often find them muttering? Do they light candles in their windows on Friday night? Do they, like, literally there are lists of things that people were told to look for, right? And Jews, of course, were being persecuted because they were a bad influence on the new Christians. It's important to understand, though, that when the Inquisition finally comes to Spain, it is an office of the Catholic Church which is empowered only to judge Catholics. The Inquisition did not punish the Jews. The king punished the Jews. Right? It was a partnership. In fact, that was one of the reasons that the Inquisition was ultimately let into Spain. There was a tremendous resistance. Trust me, they've been trying to bring the Inquisition to Spain for a long time. There was a tremendous resistance to it, depending on what perspective you take on this, and I think there's a bit of both. First of all, one is that the local Spanish church was very zealous and jealous of its individual power. Right? The church, the Inquisition is an office in Rome. So therefore, if you bring in priests who are answerable to Rome, they're no longer answerable to the ecclesiastical structure in Spain. That's never good. Right? You don't want competition, number one. Number two, a little noted but it's significant fact of the Inquisition is that when someone was condemned and then killed by the Inquisition, their possessions were taken by the church. But if the king condemned you and killed him, your possessions were taken by the king. So the question of who gets the loot, especially when you're dealing with probably what at this point was the highest concentration of wealth in the Spanish kingdom amongst the Jews, right, is a very significant question. Nevertheless, after the new Christians are discovered celebrating Pesach, the king can no longer resist the pressure, both from outside and from within. They allow the Inquisition to enter, right? The great supporter of the Inquisition, of course, is Isabella. Torquemada was the Grand Inquisitor.
What does that mean, allow it to enter? Like,
they give whatever the ecclesiastical agreement that needed to be made, because the Church of Spain was not technically answerable to the king, but they were practically answerable to the king. So as long as the Church of Spain was unwilling to sign the agreements, and the king, of course, had a lot of power because he's giving a lot of money to the Pope, and plus in the wake of the schism of the anti-Pope and the process of healing that, there was a great delicacy and a desire not to rock the boat. The European history at this point, I don't pretend to know it all that well, but it's extremely complicated in its politics. Let's just call it. the queen, Isabella, right? Isabella of Castile, Ferdinand of Aragon. Now, they marry and they create what is the modern state of Spain. It's not really a state in the current sense, but Spain arguably is the first step in the birth of the modern nation state, right? Remember that Ferdinand himself, when he say Aragon, he also had large parts of Italy and significant chunks of what we would consider southern France. Ultimately, he's also tied into the Holy Roman Empire, so his children will rule literally hundreds of, probably tens of millions of kilometers across the globe at their height, yeah, in the 16th century. But Isabella is a tremendous believing Catholic, and Torquemada, apparently from the historical record, is able to capture her imagination and her zealous heart, not her, like, I don't want to say anything inappropriate. No, but he gets her really fired up about this. And between the years of 1480 and 1492, the Inquisition rages through Spain. Persecuting new Christians, the king and the queen combined with their power to also persecute the Jews. And at the end, in 1492, the significant event that precedes the expulsion from 1492 is the fall of the final piece of Muslim territory within the Iberian Peninsula, Granada. Right? Granada was at that point basically a city-state. I mean, it had a larger environment, so it was basically a city-state. With the fall of Granada, Spain is finally reunited. It's very important, that narrative in their minds, reunited under Christian rule, because they look back to the Visigoths as the original Christian rulers of the Iberian Peninsula. Therefore, there's a whole reconquista that's going on here. So that narrative is very important, that language of, like, who's coming back, right? Not coming here the first time, coming back, right? They unite Spain under Christian rule. No, that's kind of why I'm making the point. And in celebration of such a thing, they decide that the Jews
should be killed.
No, convert or leave. And by the way, it is not an exaggeration that the announcement was made several months before Tisha B'Av, and the date would fall out on Tisha B'Av itself. It was a final. What? So likely intentional. It's likely intentional. I mean, it's fairly well documented that the final date for the Jews to either convert or leave was on Tisha B'Av. It's likely that it was intentional, considering the number of new Christians and active converts that were involved in Spanish culture. Don't know. Like, I really don't know. There's no way to know. But it is not just one of those sort of Jewish myths that people tell, that everything bad happened on Tisha B'Av. As far as I can tell, it's actually reflected in the historical record. Two things. First of all, you should understand that the expulsion was, as I've said many times here, if it weren't for the Nazis coming along and taking the hat for all time, we would remember the Spanish as the greatest haters of the Jews, right? We're talking about, and the numbers are wildly variant in the historical record, but probably 100 to 200,000 Jews that convert, and an equal number that leave. The ones that leave, the vast majority of them go to Portugal, because Portugal was an independent state at this time, which had, of course, a land boundary. You guys know where Portugal is, yeah? It's on the Atlantic coast of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula. So, like, right, the long history between Portugal and Spain, etc. Portugal lets them stay for another 5 years, and then in 1497 does the same thing, convert or leave. The thing is that Portugal couldn't afford to have them leave, so most of them were actually forcibly converted. A few got out, but because of the financial incentive, they needed the Jews there, and so most of them were actually forcibly converted, thus increasing the problem of these new Christians who were forced converts, right? The rest of them, many of them were, of course, it's not like they had anywhere to go. Who was going to take them? The Europeans weren't going to take them. They couldn't go over the Pyrenees, because they'd already been expelled from France in 1306. They weren't going to let them back. To get to the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire indeed opened its doors to these Jews. The problem was they had to go by boat. And so therefore, there are many horrific stories of pirates, people sold into slavery. Remember, slavery was a major global industry at this time, right? Just predatory practices, et cetera, et cetera. The horror of it is such that the Jewish tradition is that the exiles from Spain made an oath and bound their children never to return to Spain. So much so that I could show you, if I could find exactly where it is, a tshuva by Rav Ovadia Yosef, I think in the last decade of his life, someone, or actually no, it was from earlier, it was earlier tshuva, someone asking him whether it was permissible for a Jew to visit Spain, or whether we were not still bound by the oath of our Holy Spanish ancestors. answer, interesting enough, is very telling for us because what's his answer going to be? You guys know already from this context. Could the Jews of Spain bind all Jewry for all time not to go back to Spain? No. Why not? Exactly. We'd already passed the age of the Gaonim, and the whole concept of a central voice in halachic practice was gone. Right? Nevertheless, I wanted to ask a question, Ari, before I keep spilling on.
When you say, like, they were economically important to Portugal, are they still bankers at this point?
They had massive portable wealth. They were also merchants, right? And the ability of Portugal to soak them for their money was just too important to them.
So they're like a mix of merchants and bankers with like a bunch of gold.
Probably the most famous story is the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel, who we think of, depending if you think of him at all, is a late Rishon. Of course, he was expelled from Spain, so that's basically this is the end of the era of the Rishonim, right? Biblical exegete. There's a fun word that doesn't get used enough, right? And for our purposes, also, maybe most importantly in this context, he was the finance minister of Spain. And then, of course, once he was expelled from Spain, he was the finance minister of Portugal for about 5 years. And he actually managed to get out of Portugal, and we'll speak about where he went and the significance of that in 1 second. So they tell the story like this, that at a certain point, the Abarbanel realized after the edict of expulsion was given, they were given 3 months to sell their possessions. They were forbidden to take their possessions out. They were given 3 months to sell their possessions. Now, you're talking about massive landed estates, villas, immovable property. And, of course, what happens when you dump a bunch of immovable property on a market, right? When people know that if we don't buy it, you're just going to leave it behind anyway, right? So, like, the things were sold for pennies, right? People losing lifetimes worth of fortunes, right? So the Abarbanel goes in to speak to Ferdinand and Isabella. He gets an audience because he is the finance minister. And the story says he slams a bag of gold down on the table and says, "This is 1/10 of 1 drop of what you owe to the Jewish people in helping them build your empire." And don't think he was exaggerating. We spoke about the role that the Jews played in the birth of modern commerce, right? And how important liquidity was in the feudal economy, right? Not only liquidity, but how important having international people who could make transactions between Christian Spain and the East, where the silk trade and the spice trade were still a major source of income. So, nevertheless, it's probably also reasonable to assume that he didn't plan on taking the bag of gold back. He wasn't going to pick it back off the table. They began to argue with Ferdinand and Isabella about their moral debt to the Jewish people. In walks Torquemada. And he sees this Jew with a bag of gold, pleading with the king and queen. And he walks up and he slams a crucifix down on the table. And he says, "Go ahead, sell him again." And that he was the Grand Inquisitor. And that was it. Right? So the Abarbanel, like I said,
Sell him again, meaning sell Jesus again?
yeah.
Because he was Judas.
Yeah. Betrayal. Betrayal for money.
Okay.
I mean, don't go too far with the metaphor. His point was, yeah, sell him again for money.
As in, don't listen to the Jew.
Don't listen to the Jew. Right? So the Abarbanel is expelled to Portugal, as I said. He serves there for 5 years as finance minister for the king. He eventually he manages to escape when most of Portuguese Jewry is forcibly converted. He goes first. I think his first stop was Naples. He took refuge in the Italian city-states.
This is the Abarbanel that the wine's named after?
Probably. I mean, it's a whole very, very famous, one of the probably the most aristocratic Spanish Jewish lineage that maintained its Jewish practice. We'll speak maybe about Josip Nasi in the Ottoman Empire, depending on how much detail we really get into today. Italy, it's very interesting that the Abarbanel writes, and I believe it's in Sefer Shmuel. If I'm not incorrect, it's in his discussion about why Shmuel rejects, or why Shmuel is so upset when people ask for a king. Over in the 8th parak, I'm pretty confident that's where it is. The Abarbanel famously is the only Rishon who says that there's no mitzvah to appoint a king. And there are others that have differences about what the mitzvah is, or if it is actually a mitzvah, or if it's Gilmi, etc., etc. But he outright says, impossible. Impossible to tell you that you have to have a king because I know kings, he says. And he does. They've brought more evil to the world than any other institution I've known. And he's now living in the Italian city-states, which were basically oligarchies. They were like, quasi-democratic oligarchies. So, if you had enough money and social influence, then you could join the city council. But the city councils were elected and they rotated. And he speaks at length about the nobility of a type of government where the people who are in control now know that there will others that come, there'll be others that come after them who will have the power to punish them for negligence and, outright dishonesty. Right? It's a very interesting perspective. I mean, he's giving you Pshat in Devarim and in Shmuel, but it's through the lens of his historical experience. The Abarbanel was arguably one of the last people willing to do that on that level, right? Because he was relating to the Torah and the Tanakh as relevant in his day, and not as an abstract theological concept that existed either in the past or just simply in an immutable ideal. And it's in many ways, but in one of the primary ways at the close of the age of Rishonim is how that power is released. Right? And when the Achronim begin to look back at the Rishonim in the same way that the Amoraim began to look back at the Tanaim as sort of an immutable conceptual framework, this will be yet another piece in the shift into modernity for Am Yisrael.
Can you clarify the mind shift of the Achronim that the Torah no longer applies?
No. They don't argue. It's very simple. They don't argue with the Rishonim. Now, they might dance between the Rishonim, and that's not hard and fast, because there will be people that we think of as Achronim who absolutely do. The Gra is the best example, right? And we're going to speak more about this concept when I get to the Shulchan Aruch, so I'm just throwing it out there. But you know what? The expulsion from Spain actually puts one finger onto the Shulchan Aruch, because at age 1488, 15, at age 4, Rabbi Yosef Karo, young, not rabbi yet, little Yossi Karo, right, Yosef, right, is expelled from Spain with his parents, right? They wander until they find a home in the Ottoman Empire, and of course he eventually makes his way famously to Sfat, right? And when people ask me, well, a second. So the first major work that Rabbi Yosef Karo writes is the Kesef Mishnah. Kesef Mishnah. First thing he writes is a commentary on the Rambam, because that's how he sort of like cuts his halachic teeth, so to speak. Right? Because if you can write a commentary on the Rambam, then you got what to say. And people realize this person had what to say very quickly. Right? His next major work was the Beit Yosef. Beit Yosef is a commentary. Remember the Tur? We talked about the Tur. What did the Tur do? The Tur took the whole diversity of the Rishonim and tried to boil them down into a digestible, conclusive, what would you call it? Not really an index, just psak. A code. Thank you. A code, right? What did the Beit Yosef do? He re-expanded it. He basically reconstituted the Tur. He added water and stirred and mixed, and he explained where there was the argument in the Gemara, and how did the Rishonim actually think, and which Rishonim did the Torah not either ever see or mention, because we live in a world of absolute information, right? You pull out a little disk on key, plug into your computer, you could have every Rishon you could ever imagine, way more than you'll ever be able to read, right? But of course, in the Torah's day was before the printing press, so if the Torah did not actually own the book, that meant he never read it. Do not miss that point. If he didn't actually own the book, which means if he didn't pay somebody to hand write it, he never saw it. So therefore, the Beit Yosef, of course, is already after the printing press, right? The Guggenheim's press, which, I mean, it's important to remember, of course, the printing technology had been around for a long time. Chinese, Gutenberg, what did I say? Right, Guggenheim, Gutenberg, Iceberg, Feinberg, Goldberg, it's all the same to me, right? You know that joke, right? No?
No problem.
All right. I'll talk to you later. I'm always looking for somebody who doesn't know the joke yet. All right. My wife didn't know. It was like one of the highest moments of our marriage. I was like, you don't know that joke? I'm so excited. All right. Anyway, the technology for printing had been a long time. It likely was the Chinese that invented it. Woodblock press is a very primitive form of printing that had been around for a long time. But the key of Gutenberg is it was movable type. You could actually set these small letters into a plate and then start cranking them out. And when you're done, you could dump type back into the box and set it again. And the job of a typesetter was actually very laborious and somewhat boring, but extremely important, because if the guy doesn't put the letters in the right place, backwards, remember, he's doing it backwards, right? Then it's not going to work.
Can I just non sequitur with the story about the Rambam?
No.
You know what I'm talking about.
Focusing. So when the Gutenberg press comes online in 1440, I have here, right? The significance, it takes a little while, but the Jews are amongst the first to jump into the printing industry. Their Jewish printing houses jump up all over Europe. By the way, so many of them are printing Christian books, right? And don't think that a Jewish printing house solely prints. In fact, there's like a famous anti-Semitic text that attempts to use the Zohar and other sort of Kabbalistic references to prove that the Jews hate the Christians. Printed by Sonsino, right? Like a certain degree, business is business, But I just want you, aside from the impact it has on the world, so what do you think about this? What happens when you drop a sitter? Even better, I got a 4-year-old who, when he's reading Pinkalicious, if it falls down, you know what he does? He picks it up and kisses it. Not all the time, but he often does it. Why? Because he's seen, you dropped something important, probably a sitter or a chumash, you pick up and kiss it. A people that kisses its books when they fall, what happens when those books just start cranking out by the dozens, by the hundreds? See, why were they kissing those books? Because a book is a sacred thing. Anything that was important enough to be hand copied and to be passed on is a massive amount of work and money, right? So the very fact that there was a book gave it importance. That doesn't mean there wasn't nonsense written before this. There's been nonsense written since the first time figured out you could scratch in the mud and make little silly faces, right? No, but the importance of the existence of a scroll or a folio page, right, was tremendous. That doesn't fade with the birth of the printing press. And what happens is that knowledge begins to make inroads into Am Yisrael in ways that it never would have otherwise. Because all you need now is a little bit of money, and increasingly less money. Right? At first, it's still expensive, and there's a whole capital issue, and that's why that concept of a publisher exists, because they're the ones that have enough money in their pocket to actually pay for printing. But progressively, as the technology spreads, as it improves, right, as the printing houses multiply, it becomes cheaper and cheaper to the point where, as we know today,
Just print stuff.
yeah, any Yahoo who's got an internet connection can just crank it out. He doesn't even need to print it anymore. He can just publicize it in the internet. It's on the cloud, man, right? So the impact is extremely hard to value. Why do I say that? Because Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote first the Kesef Mishnah, that's how he cut his teeth in halacha. Then he wrote the Beit Yosef to prove who he really was, right? Now, then his third major work, and there are others in there.
Not two.
What?
Not two proof.
No, as a proof of, it became the proof of who he was, right? All right, who basically was probably the most respected authority in his day. Certainly afterwards, once he was dead, he became. The third stage was called the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is basically a parallel of the Torah, where he now took this expanded work of the Beit Yosef and boiled it back down into a definitive code. There's a big machloket over his intention in doing that. There was a huge controversy when he did it, but I don't want to focus on that right now. I want to focus on his intention. Was he intending to do the same thing that Torah did, which was to give you a practical guide for how to paskin halacha, or was it a study aid? When he realized that, those of us who spent enough time with the Beit Yosef know you don't plow through the Beit Yosef, right? You're going to crank through that and just get a good look. But you know what? The Shulchan Aruch, if you want to just do chazara, right, you can see what the major points are. And it's a machloket of what his intention was when he wrote it. I don't want to get into that too much. Today, even certainly amongst historical scholars, it's pretty much been given up amongst the religious world. But in his day, there was a camp. He died not long after. He lived from 1488 to 1575, and the first printing that we have, which we think is actually the first printing of the Shulchan Aruch, is in 1564.
Before he died.
Yeah, before he died, but not long, about 11 years, right? So, hang on a second. So, don't miss this, because when people ask me who was the last Rishon, I will always say Beit Yosef. When they say who was the first Achron, I'll say Shulchan Aruch. I mean, obviously, there's a joke there because it's the same person, but it's not a joke. Because these are the two faces of history right there. And what lies literally in between them, not chronologically, but literally, is the printing press. As information begins to flow more rapidly, and the book loses its status as intrinsically important, the importance of a codification of definitive opinions not only rises in objective sense, but the anxiety of modernity necessitates it. How on earth am I supposed to know what to do? Because now they just printed the Rashba and the Ritva and the Rambam and the Meiri I've got all these books. What do I do with them? Oh, thank God for the Shulchan Aruch. It's all a set table. I know what to do. Yeah. Question.
At the Yosef Karo's kid married Arizal's kid, is that right?
I don't know.
Okay.
I never heard that.
It's been a crazy wedding.
So they're gone from Spain. The exiles are scattered, and they see themselves as a separate nation. They call them nación, right? And we're not going to have time to go into the depth of modernity, but they will keep an identity which in many ways will contribute to modern Jewish identity in the sense of a secular Jewish culture. Arguably the most famous descendant, many of the conversos, when they escape Spain and go to places like Amsterdam or the New World, will return to their Jewish practice. And who is the most famous child of conversos who return to their Jewish practice?
Spinoza?
Most, yes. Baruch Spinoza, or Benedict, depending on. Right? And who will, not during his lifetime, but certainly after his death, be recognized as actually one of the most important European philosophers ever, and one of the fathers of the Enlightenment. That's a story for next year. So, keeping focus on where we are, the exiles are scattered. What's happening in Ashkenaz at the same time? Ashkenaz at the same time, we spoke about Black Plague. I mentioned the Hussite Wars. We can't go into what it really was. But between the Black Plague and the Hussite Wars, the backbone of Western European Jewry is broken. And the fact that 2 centuries before, the Polish had invited them in, giving them financial status and then legal status, despite the objections of the Catholic Church, now meant there was an open door to the east, and the Jews began to flood into what is now Poland. It was also Poland then, just not in the same political sense, right? And in about 1500, right, that's only eight years after the expulsion from Spain, Rabbi Yosef Yaakov Pollack founds a yeshiva in Krakow, right? And he begins to teach Pilpul. What's Pilpul? It's a pepper. No. Tosfos on steroids. Pilpul is the dialectic for its own sake. Meaning the Tosfos were interested in the dialectic. We spoke about the dialectic method, right? 2 pieces to the dialectic method of learning. Number 1, every piece of the Gemara relates to every other piece, right? When the Mishnah in Brachos says Mematai, the assumption of the Gemara is that you know the whole Gemara so that you can see that piece of Mishnah in its light, which is exactly how the Gemara starts. Why does the Gemara start relating to that? Where were we just now? Wait, you start at the beginning of the book. The first page of the book doesn't say what we were just talking about, does it? Right? But that's exactly how the Gemara in Brachos starts. And don't miss the importance of that, because it's trying to teach you something fundamental about what the Gemara is. It is not a linear document. It is a holistic document. Therefore, anywhere you start, you're at the beginning, or the middle, or the end. That's one piece. The other piece is, right, the truth emerges through argument. Everyone takes a position, right? And we argue about it, and through our reasoning, proof, and dialectic, something emerges, right? In the Gemara, that's how the Amoraim will relate to the Tanaic statements, right? It's how the Tosfos related to the Gemara, but the primary goal of the Tosfos was still elucidating Pshat of the Gemara, believe it or not, and the halachic material. There was also some virtuosity that was happening in there. They were very high-powered intellects. But what happens with the Pilpul is now that the codes exist, the Tur, Shulchan Aruch is going to come online soon, right? And that just begins a whole process, right? The act of learning Torah and the act of deriving the halacha begin to diverge. They'll never be totally divergent, right? But today, in the yeshiva system, what do people do? What's learning? Normative learning in the yeshiva system is what? Gemara, right? And then if you eventually want to go for smicha, what do? You learn halacha, right? What? Where'd you get such an idea?
The Rosh Yeshiva isn't necessarily the posek against the
No, not at all. Not at all. The Rosh Yeshiva is no way. The Rosh Yeshiva is the one who gives the most impressive shir. He's the one that can chop the Gemara, right? And Pilpul is really the shifting point in that process. Notice where it's planted right there, where these codes are starting to come into existence, where halacha becomes a subset profession of learning Torah, and where the virtuosity of the mind is going to become particularly important. Because though Poland, due to its geographic concentration of Jews and their relative civil autonomy. Those two things, of course, haven't existed since Bavel. We spoke about the importance in Bavel of that geographic concentration and political civil autonomy that allowed the Gaonim to really generate Torah. With the same thing will reproduce itself in Poland. In 1533, right, Sigmund I of Poland will allow the Jews to establish autonomous courts. They are not allowed to give death penalty, but more or less everything short of the death penalty is left for the Jews to adjudicate, right? And even that, by the way, they work with the non-Jewish authorities if that ever becomes necessary. Tremendous, tremendous power, tremendous geographic concentration, and also eventually tremendous poverty and misery. So, but why does a pilpul matter? I'll tell you exactly why. How is it possible? We're all Jews here, chosen people. God loves us, right? That's really easy to say when you're sitting in the modern state of Israel. If you were sitting in 17th century Poland, right, and you may think you're cool, but the most crass, boor, low Polish citizen is still going to spit you in the face and call you a dirty Jew. How on earth could you think you were the spiritual nobility of the world? I'll tell you exactly how. These Yeshiva Bachrim were the original ghetto superstars. They had it all going on in their heads. They were walking down the streets, flipping and turning, spinning in the stars, generating new thoughts, new horizons, things that these stupid Poles couldn't even imagine. And that sense of inner power will carry Polish Jewry through a tremendous, tremendous several centuries of challenge. And so the pilpul, on one hand, is fought vehemently. People like the Maharal 100 years later will disparage the act of pilpul in many ways. Maharal, by the way, also was opposed to what the Shulchan Aruch represented, in the sense that Maharal says you paskin halacha from the Gemara. You don't separate halacha from Gemara, even though, of course, that had been happening since the Rif. It wasn't a chiddush, right? The Marshal fought it, etc., and the Bot fought it. And eventually everybody was drawn into the reality. Fight how you will. We live in the world of the Shulchan Aruch, right? But the power, right? I'll tell you another story. I remember, unfortunately, these things are starting to become part of our consciousness again. When I first came there to sail in this cycle, 12 years ago, it was the height of the Oslo War, which I do call it. And there was bombs every week. Major cities, people dying, blood in the streets. I remember Sunday morning I was in a shiur with a man who became my Masada Kedushin, Rabbi Seth Farber, Mensch. Hope he's doing well. I'm spoken to him a lot. And it was Sunday morning. That Motzei Shabbos, there was that double bomb in Kikar Tzion, where a bunch of teenagers were killed, and then they set the second bomb to go off about 15 minutes later, so that when the emergency forces arrived to help them, they were struck by the second bomb. And I actually heard the explosion because my then girlfriend, soon-to-be fiance, and now wife, and I were actually at Kikar Tzion only about an hour or so beforehand. Happened to us 2 or 3 times actually in Yerushalayim that year. It's pretty crazy. And I remember going home, I was taking off my shoes to go to bed, and I heard the boom. Not good. And about 15 minutes there, boom. Of course, everybody knows what's going on. In the morning, wake up, see the news. So I went into shiur and I said to my Rav, how on earth are we supposed to learn Torah right now? How are we supposed to learn Torah? There's blood flowing in the streets of Yerushalayim. What are we doing right now? And he said, look, you're right, but I want to tell you something. This is what we do. Sometimes when you can't do anything about it, you just go into the world of Abaye and Rabbah. And that is so much of the power that pilpul introduced into Polish Jewry. And this is part of what I'm getting at in terms of how the Jew will begin to relate to modernity. We're going to turn inward. And the fact that that in turn is associated with a deep rejection of the outward. Right? When you open up the Tanya, the Baal Tanya tells you that a non-Jew doesn't have a soul like we do. Right? You guys remember that Tanya? I mean, you can slice it however you want. That's basically what he says. Right? Now, I have a question for you. Aside from the theological, and it's machloket, by the way. It's machloket. I don't think he's the only opinion out there. How many non-Jews do you think that the Baal Tanya really interacted with on an intimate basis? I mean, aside from the ones that rampaged through the town or the ones that threw in prison, right? I mean, so like, was it so absolutely unreasonable that the Baal Tanya would read the sources and look at the people around him and say, yeah, clearly not. I mean, I sat at the table with Baal Shtov, or at least with the mugging, right? Like, I know what a soul looks like. And these guys, they ain't got one. But as we all know, of course, the soul is evoked. It doesn't just happen. Right? So therefore, the way in which we, who are the keepers of soul, as far as the Bunch Olam is concerned, the way in which we orient ourselves to the world is, in many ways, the way in which the world will respond. the soul is evoked. It doesn't just happen. It happens, and the Rebbeinu Shalom, you know, he can do what he wants. And the soul does indeed happen in many ways. But part of the story of European history will be this inward turning with the outward pushing away as European society, on one hand, becomes more and more civilized, on the other hand, more and more brutal toward the Jews. And we're going to be holding a very big question about what exactly is going on. So I got about 5 minutes. I'm going to end here. So, wow, there's so much going on. So, we're going to leave the Jews of Poland to stew in their juices for the next 400 or so years. Yeah. Oh. We're going to jump back to Sfat. Because, of course, famously, Rabbi Yosef Karo was the only person in Sfat. Right? Even before he got there, there was already a contingent of Mukbali people, right, under Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, who were expecting redemption. And we're digging deeper. Since the Zohar had been revealed in the 13th century, that relationship we spoke about between darkness and light, how Rashi went into the cave and he brought out the light. And that ultimately, when Rav Moshe de Leon brought the Zohar to light, it was in the midst of tremendous persecutions in Spain. Right? That Shraga b'tihara my mahani. What good does a candle do in the noonday? The real power of the light happens when the world is getting darker. Right? So the Gerushe Sfard will carry their experience of exile into Svat, and what emerges there will be of tremendous power. I want to speak about two things really briefly in that respect. One is the Smicha controversy. Right? Now, I did some work trying to look into this, and it was a chiddush to me, but it actually makes sense. Why is it, right, the Halachic Torah spot when Rav Yosef Karo got there was Rav Beirav, who became his teacher and his master, and ultimately Rav Beirav became convinced that the way to move Am Yisrael forward was to return Smicha, actual rabbinic authority. What we have today, if you guys are not aware, what we call Smicha today is not Smicha. Smicha originally is an institution that began with Moshe Rabbeinu, literally with laying on of hands to Yoshua. We can trace it all the way down. Basically, you know, like Rebbe Meir and the Chavei were basically the last, you know, the story of Rebbe Yoshua, Bava ben Bava, Yehuda ben Bava. I never remember if it's Yoshua or Yehuda. Yehuda ben Bava, which we spoke about late antiquity, so I'm not going to tell you the story again. But Smicha basically disappears largely because the Romans hunted down and killed everyone who had it. And because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was unwilling to give Smicha to anyone who was going to leave Eretz Yisrael. Right? You remember that whole discussion? Well, if you don't, you can look back at the notes. But Rabbi Rav looked into the Rambam and became convinced that if all of the sages of Eretz Yisrael agreed, the Rambam says it, but I mean the Rambam says it clearly. But because the Rambam says it, we look at the Rambam like there was no argument, right? The Rambam said it, and he said this is halacha l'maisa, and we're going to do it. That's my point, right? And he decided we're going to bring back this institution. Now, interestingly enough, I saw a great argument of why. Why now? Why is it so important now? What shifted?
Now or now back then?
Now then, as opposed to now. So, one of the major drivers seems to have been what? The experience of the Gerushe Sfard had two phases. First of all, the sense of crushing destruction that could only mean that redemption was imminent. 400 plus years ago, almost 500 at this point, almost 500. You're right, more than 500. 500 plus years ago. Thank you. Math is not my strong suit, nor is spelling. But I'm great with concepts. Anyway, but it wasn't just that sense of imminent redemption. It was also the sense of being stuck. Many of these people had bowed to the cross. And they felt that despite their efforts at being Balei Tshuva, that there was no way to really do penance, to actually return. And Rabbi Rav became convinced that the solution would be to create courts that could actually give Malchus in place of Kari. But a court that can give Malchut, whips, actually has to have Smicha. And so, in order to release these individuals and to empower Am Yisrael, to think of the power of moving forward into history. We're not living in this halachic past anymore, Because once you have a court that has smicha, you create an institution that begins to move forward toward having a Sanhedrin, which can now adjudicate law on the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. Mamish. He began that process. He gathered together all the sages in Tzfat, sent a letter to the Maharal Bach down into Jerusalem, who was the head of the rabbis of Jerusalem, a little bit late, because he had already ordained Rabbi Yosef Karo and himself. He gathered. It was like when the Gabbai says, "Call me up for an aliyah." He was like, I'm going to ordain you guys, and then you ordain me, and we'll all ordain each other. And it was like, great. Now we're all rabbis, which they were before, sort of. Not really, apparently. But they didn't speak. But of course, the Maharal Bach was zealous for the honor of Jerusalem, and said, "You can't do that. You can't do that. You should have come to us first, et cetera, because they assumed, at least it seems from the evidence, they assumed that he would have no problem with it. They were just kind of doing a courtesy of inviting him along." Right, and from Beirut, right? And so therefore, the effort, even though there were a couple of what's the word I'm looking for? Hemshech. There was some continuity. Rav Al-Shich was the person that right, conferees, right? The attempt at smicha died out. The other piece, I got a couple more minutes here, is of course famously who else was in Tzfat? The Arizal. The Arizal appears in Tzfat in 1570, as far as we can tell. He was first in Eretz Yisrael and then in Egypt, and then came to Tzfat. He was only there for 2 years. He was there for 2 years before he died. He never wrote anything down. In fact, we have testimony that he told his students that it was forbidden to write down his words and take them outside of Eretz Yisrael. Because I would argue that Geula is always in the present. Right? He understood full well how radical what he was doing was. And I want to put it in this frame for you guys because this is it. Next week, I'm going to do a wrap-up share, but this is it for our efforts. And we've actually made it. We made it. I feel pretty good about that. Right? We got antiquity, and we're on the verge of modernity. So what do the Arizal, well, what makes the Torah of the Arizal unique, aside from the fact that it's just so hard to understand, which is actually not so unique when it comes to Torah, right? Is that when the Arizal began to rework the Kabbalistic system into what the academics will now know as Lurianic Kabbalah, what was his proof? Experience. He said, well, in my vision, this is what I saw. Or this is how I understand the nature of God's relationship to the world. Well, he also was a Talmid Chacham, don't get me wrong. It wasn't just like making this stuff up. But the primary assertion is that it came from his soul. This is a return of experience as an actual source of authority. Up until now, we've been moving further away from experience and deeper into tradition. The Shulchan Aruch is the ultimate example of tradition being the sole basis for authority. We do it because we always did it, even if we didn't actually always do it that way. I'm going to tell you that's how we always did it because I'm going to marshal the halachic structures to show you that's how it at least should have been done. And those are the people that weren't doing it, either I'll justify it some way or I'll just say they were sinners. You understand? That's what codification is. Codification is tradition equals authority. If it's not part of the canon, then it's heresy, or at the very least, a bad idea. The Arizal actually says the exact opposite. I'm looking for God. Right? I'm looking for God here and now. Right? All those stories about like Mashiach, if we all get up right now, he says to his students, and we go to Yerushalayim, Mashiach is going to come. And what's of course the response of all the students? Wait, let me just, I can't tell my wife, I'm going to pack my bag. And you missed it. Be here now. That's what's going to bring Mashiach. No, don't misunderstand. He was a master of the written and oral Torah. My point is that here at Tzfat, something cracked open where there was a solidification of the tradition to the point where the Shulchan Aruch was so solid, people started to fight against it. Rabbis started to fight against it. Like, too solid, bad idea. On the other hand, radical light shining through. And the Arizal actually comes up with a cosmology in his doctrines of Tikkun and his understanding of like cosmology in the sense of development of reality, which could actually absorb something as awful as the Holocaust. Because don't forget, see, though the Arizal didn't know the Holocaust was going to happen, we do. So if we understand the Torah of the Arizal to actually be descriptive of God's plan for creation, that means that we have to be able to understand how the Holocaust fits into it. You follow my logic? So he's the first person who can really, because the Rizal is telling you that there's a role for brokenness and evil in the world. He wasn't the first to give it. It's just his particular description of it, and the empowerment of the individual on the cosmic scale is quite significant. And I mean, maybe we'll speak about it more next week. But once he introduces something which becomes accepted by Am Yisrael as the cosmology under which we operate, then everything that happens afterwards has to fit, or you have to rework the cosmology. You could just say he was wrong. You gotta have Kalim hold that, and tradition ain't gonna do it. Right? These two pieces are what will carry Am Yisrael forward into modernity. An incredible bolting down of tradition as the centerpiece of authority, and an amazing opening out of experience, because of course will lead to Hasidut. He will also lead to the Reform movement. He will give birth to Sabbatianism, and in many ways, the Zionists also. Because as soon as you return experience to a center place in authority, at some point or another, somebody's going to pick their head up and say, I'm going to do this because I think it's right. And I'm not going to do that as a rebel. I'm going to do it as a representative. Right? This is what's happening in Sfat. This is what's happening today is flying apart at the seams. Because both the doubt of experience and the sort of dismal status that tradition has in the eyes of most people are begging us to now figure out, if this is what launched us into the modernity, what is it that's going to take Am Yisrael into the future? So, and we have one more shir next week. I'll try to wrap up these thoughts and at least set us on a solid foundation. Shkoyach.